subscribe.
Welcome to another episode of Sister Sharpens Sister. You will see me, Karen, and Delina today because Shalon is traveling. And today we are going to be discussing food history. Is that a good name for it? Food history?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Food history in the United States in the century of 1800 to 1899. So the 19th century. Now, when we're talking about food history in America at this time, the first grocery store had not even been invented. I'm doing that in quotes, invented, until 1916. And that, Delana, was in Memphis, Tennessee, which I'm sure you're going to talk about in your episode covering the 20th century. And the first commercial fridge was not even available for households until 1913, although it wasn't very common until quite a bit later. And Delana will cover that as well. So the question becomes, how did Americans eat in the early 1800s? Surprisingly, it wasn't that different from the 1700s because it was mostly seasonal and regional. In spring and summer, people ate a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables, either in the wild through foraging or they would grow things on their own property in farms. Because the family farm was very common in the 1800s in the United States. Now, in the fall and winter, the foods would have been eaten as well, but they would have been sun-dried or pickled, canned, but not like canning of today. Or they would have something what they called root cellar vegetables, and take it from the name root cellar, root vegetables. So you're going to have your potatoes and your carrots and your radishes and your parsnips, things of that nature. Huh?
Your onions.
Onions, yes. Onions would keep as well, especially if you strung them up. You remember we used to do that.
Yeah,
string
we
up
did.
Onions. People today will do that, but they'll put them in like the leg of a pantyhose and then tie a knot and put another onion in. You see?
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. Haven't done it, but I've seen it.
There are some leafy vegetables that will work well in a root cellar for a period of time. That's cabbage, kale. Where's my list? Well, cabbage and kale.
Short list.
Short list. Squash would also work. And things like apples, pears, and some berries would keep in root cellars as well. But the other things that you could keep in your root cellar would be things like salt cured or sugar cured meats, canned jams or preserves, or if you were in the area of being able to get herring, salted herring would keep in the root cellar as well.
Right. Well, when Karen and I grew up, our family had a root cellar.
Yes.
And in the root cellar, we not only had root vegetables, but our parents would keep the quote unquote canned foods there, like canned green beans and tomatoes and peaches. Anything that they canned would be kept there as well because it's cold. It's much cooler than what's out where the sun can get it.
Right. Yeah. Or even in your kitchen. Now, apples will keep in a root cellar, but typically they need to be kept away from other vegetables and fruits because apples release something called ethylene gas, which makes things ripen quicker. So if you buy apples and bananas and you keep them beside of one another on the counter, you better eat your apples pretty quickly.
Or the bananas for this.
Or the bananas. Yeah. Now, in the modern era, this is Karen's opinion, I think the root cellar has given way to the wine cellar.
Yeah, it's kind of a root cellar, I guess. It's cherries.
Kinda.
Not cherries, excuse me, grapes.
Grapes, yeah. Between 1800 and 1850, people were widespread across the continental United States. The 1800 census records a population of around 6 million. And in 1850, it had exploded to 23 million. And that was due to a lot of immigration and the availability of new land. The current population as of January the 1st, 2024, was estimated at 336 million documented Americans. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a lot of people, for sure.
So from the 1700s through the first half of the 1800s, not a lot had changed as far as the typical household for the average family. Food was seasonal, fruits and vegetables in the spring and summer. You hunted for your meats, or you kept animals on your property, on your farms, and you would harvest those for your meats. Think mutton, beef, pork,
Mm-hmm.
chickens, ducks, geese, things like that. And hunting would have been for things like deer, elk, bison, bear,
Mm-hmm.
rabbits, pigeons, which we've discussed that were like, what was it? They went extinct in 1914.
Yeah. Well, the passenger pigeon did.
Yeah, the passenger pigeon. Now, in the second half of the 1800s, a lot of things started happening. Um, the 1830s, something called the ice box was becoming more popular in the average American home. And the ice box was invented in 1802 by an American farmer and cabinet maker. And this was the heyday of ice harvesting. Some people may not know what that is. Ice harvesting is a winter task, obviously, and they would cut big blocks of ice from frozen rivers, lakes, and ponds. And then those blocks of ice would be transported to an ice house for storage so they could be used or sold later on. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
ice harvesting is rare today, but it was really common before the widespread electric refrigerator became available. In 1850s, the railways were becoming ever popular for transport, not only of people or mail, but also for clothing, household goods like furniture, and food. And in 1869, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railways joined at Promontory Summit in Utah. Now, this event became known as something called the Golden Spike Ceremony. I don't know if kids are taught this in history today, but I know that Delina and I both learned about it.
Mm-hmm.
But this kicked off the American Industrial Revolution because you had the availability to transport not only food or and people, but product from one
Mm-hmm.
side of the country to the other.
Mm-hmm.
So,
In a much shorter period of time.
correct. You're
Mm-hmm.
not horse-drawn carriage.
Yeah.
So if you think about the movie Wild Wild West, anytime I hear Promontory Point, that's what I always think of, the big spider coming over the hill. But there was a lot of arguing between those two rail companies about where it was going to happen. And Ulysses S. Grant, who was president at the time, said, you know what? I'm just going to stop funding for the railways if you guys can't make a decision. So they finally made a decision and put it right there in Utah. Um, and the golden spike is not there now. Just so you know, it was taken out immediately after it was put in because, they don't want anybody to steal it. It was pure gold.
Mm-hmm.
And gold's not strong enough to hold a rail down for a train anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it was purely ceremonial. And it was donated to the Stanford Museum, which is now the Cantor Art Center in 1898. Now, just a side note here. Leland Stanford is the guy that was not President Grant in the movie Wild Wild West. It was President Grant that was driving the Spike, but he didn't do that in real life. It was Leland Stanford, and he
Mm-hmm.
took a mallet, which was a silver mallet specially made for this event, and he struck the Spike. And all the newspapers were snapping their pictures, right? Or no, not like this. They would have been under the cloth, squeezing the little ball.
Yeah.
But you know what? When he swung it, the mallet, he missed. I just thought that was funny.
Yeah.
So, before the advent of steam navigation and railroads, each town was dependent on the immediate surrounding area for their produce and any kind of meats that they got. So, any markets would have only been supplied by what was in season. Now, the railroads made that, you could get things that were quote unquote out of season.
Mm-hmm.
Records show that California's citrus industry benefited greatly in the 1880s and 1890s because within 10 years of the first rail shipment that they made, the volume of citrus moving east had grown to more than 2,000 rail cars annually. And in another 5 years, it had doubled. So refrigerated cars were first used. Now, this is on the railway. Refrigerated cars were first used in 1851. And initially, it used those ice blocks, and the ice blocks would be put in the front and the rear of each car, and there would be a little breezeway, and that would keep the produce cooled off, right? So before that, the produce would either arrive water soaked or water damaged because they had been shipped in cars that were meant for livestock, meaning that it was pretty much open, or it would arrive rotten because when they put it inside of an enclosed rail car, the heat kind of pretty much decimated what you were receiving. Now, there was something called a tank car that was invented in 1865, which is exactly what it sounds like. They took a flatbed rail car and put big tanks on it. And in these, they would ship things like pickles that would be in brine and oysters on ice. But before the advent of the railroad, you had the horse and carriage, right? In the 17th and 18th century, the carriage was extremely expensive, not only to purchase, but also to maintain, because think about it, not only did you have to maintain the wheels and the seats and the everything else that's on the carriage, you had to maintain horses to pull it. But starting around 1820, it started getting a little less cost prohibitive, but people still didn't like to use it because the carriage was extremely uncomfortable. Not only for people riding in it, if people were going, think about stagecoach, that's a horse and carriage.
Yep.
I mean, it was uncomfortable. They had a spring system for what do you call it? What do you call it?
I don't know.
Suspension.
Is that what it is? I don't know. You're talking car stuff. One thing I know about cars is they need oil, gasoline, and a battery.
But the suspension, the spring suspension was still not very comfortable. The so because they had become, I don't know, more prevalent, I guess would be the word. The people that had businesses could afford to have the horses and the carriage and a driver to get their stuff from one place to another. So a horse-drawn delivery system, the very first Uber, it was pretty much inevitable. So depending on the load, the size of the carriage, and the breed of horse that you were using, your deliveries went from walking speed, if anybody delivered by walking, to a speed of an astonishing 4 to 12 miles per hour with the horse-drawn delivery system.
So horse dash.
Horse dash. That is awesome. Off topic again. In Seattle, Washington, there was a horse-drawn streetcar or a horse car that traveled over a fixed rail system. Think about like a trolley. And it had a set schedule, and people were using this to go to work, go do their shopping, go do leisure activities. I just thought that was interesting. Horse and carriage was pretty important because even if you weren't a business per se, you were a farmer, maybe outside of town, it was still pretty integral to the food system in 19th century America, because the quicker you can get your produce from farm to market, the quicker turnaround you have and the more money you can make, because not only can you take your product from your farm to the nearest town, you can take it to the next town as well. So you reach more people. And the use of ice boxes in a carriage helped even more, because not only would ice help keep the produce fresher, but you could travel with things like meats, cheeses, and butters for a longer distance. So eating out in 19th century America was rarely ever seen. Usually anyone traveling would pack their own lunch, as it were, usually things like breads and cheese and not anything that had to be refrigerated because the refrigerated lunchbox had not been invented yet. And any stops along the way, so if you think about stagecoach layovers and things like that, it was hit or miss whether or not you could actually get a meal. Now, to compare 18th century food and eating in America to the 21st century, it's night and day, just as much night and day as it was for the 1700s or even the 1600s or any time before that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in the 1800s, eating through winter meant that you had to have 3 to 4 month supply of food,
Mm-hmm.
and you had to have the space to store it.
Yeah.
How many people today in their homes have a root cellar? I don't have a
Well,
root cellar. I have a basement.
yeah, and see, this is not just for you, it's for your animals as well. If you have cattle or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they had root cellars, and the root cellars would be either like beside the house, they would be a completely separate building that would be partially submerged in the ground, or they
Mm-hmm.
would be completely underground.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it really wasn't affordable in the 1800s to buy tins of food. I say tins because you think about tin can, they don't have that anymore. But the 1800s population were also very connected to where their food came from.
Mm-hmm.
I have read stories online about children in Detroit not knowing where beef comes from
Mm-hmm.
or where a potato comes from other than the store.
Right.
Preservation of food in 21st century America is a science. And in the 19th century, it was used with salt, sugar, vinegar, right?
Mm-hmm.
The drying of meats, vegetables, and fruits, and the making of cheese and jam.
Mm-hmm.
Now, canning started in 1809 over in France. Nicholas Appert, I think I'm saying his name right, Appert. He's a French chef that actually won an award for developing a method of preserving food by hermetically sealing glass jars with boiling water, corks, wire, and wax. Now, in 1810, a British merchant by the name of Peter Durand patented a method for storing food in tin-lined iron cans. Brian Donkin, Donkin, who's also British, who purchased the patent along with a guy by the name of John Hall in 1811, developed a packaging process for sealing airtight tin cans. Hold on one second. Yes. A guy by the name of Thomas Kensett from England in 1812 started a business in New York, canning oysters, meats, fruits, and vegetables in hermetically sealed containers. And in 1825, he received the first American patent for tin-plated cans. And if you are hearing any noise, that is because Shalon has just came through the door.
Shh.
Now, home canning became popular in the United States shortly after the canning process had been invented. In 1858, John L. Mason invented what?
Let me
The
think.
Mason, the Mason jar with a
Yeah.
screw-on lid and a rubber seal, which is a whole lot better than using wax,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah.
But home canning was very labor intensive and slow, and it could sometimes result in tainted food. Think about E. coli or Listeria or the ever popular botulism.
Mm-hmm.
And as a side note, canning today can be done with a pressure cooker. It not only cuts down on time and the risk of contamination, but it is vitally necessary for canning meat.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if you are canning anything using vinegar, make sure you are using vinegar for canning, which is a 5% acidity and not the 4% that you're seeing sitting on the store shelves. Don't just automatically assume that you can pick up white vinegar and can something and have it last for a prolonged period of time. But there we go.
Yeah, it don't work like that.
But 1800s really not a whole lot different,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
There's
than
some
the
there's some inventions happening there, and some quote unquote processing because of the canning. That's considered processing,
yeah,
but it's different than it is today. The processing then is not the same as it is now.
right. So, and
Because when
that's
you
why
talk
I
about
hinted towards 21st century preservation of food by saying that it was a science, because later on in this series, we're going to be having a registered and licensed dietitian come and speak with us.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he's going to talk specifically about food in America versus food in Europe.
And that's going to be a good episode. We've got a little time. You want me to start on the 1900s, the 20th century? I can start on it and go through a little bit of it.
Yeah, go.
Because okay, the 1900s or the 20th century in America is when a lot of stuff happens when it comes to our food.
Exactly, which is why I think the 1900s is going to be divided into like maybe even 3 episodes.
Maybe,
Yeah.
We're going to have to play it by ear to know exactly how long we're going to need for it, because there's a whole lot going on. So 1900s Americans, what did they eat? Well, at the turn of the 20th century, people were still pretty much eating the same as they did in the 19th century. In some ways, ways they had like way back, because at the time it kind of just bled over into the 20th century. So nearly 40% of the U.S. population lived on farms in 1900, and 60% lived in rural areas. So
I mean that's something that I had meant to mention, was that when the Industrial Revolution really got kicked off and all the factories were starting, people started moving from farm to city in order to find work.
Now, only about 1% of the population lives on farms, and 20% live in rural areas like today. So it is
really
a great difference. And that comes from a U.S. Census information, and I've got the website for that.
Holy cow. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, and by today, the website gave me this information was dated 2017. So that's a few years old, but not that far back.
Right.
So basically, at the turn of the 20th century, people were hunting wild game like venison, turkey, and other wild fowl and things as such. They were fishing. If the families and households lived close to water that had fish, they would eat fish. Farm animals, if they had farm animals, they would use the farm animals. They would use eggs from the chickens and eat the chickens sometimes. Vegetables and fruits were either gathered, foraged, or they were grown. So it was pretty much the same as Karen had just talked about. Now, food transportation, Karen talked about that. Now, we do need to
nail that down.
Really far back, because food transportation was going on even back in the Egyptian times, where they used the Nile to transport foods from one neighbor community to the other.
Right. And
however,
usually it was dried stuff like grains, right?
Spices.
Yes.
Yes. Now, but they still were limited on how far they could go. We were greatly limited by that, because it takes a whole lot longer to get from here to there on a boat that is man-powered than a boat that is steam-powered or powered by fuel of some type. It takes a lot longer. It also takes a lot longer to walk or ride a horse from one place to another than it does to get in on a railroad or in an automobile and travel like that. So we have to take that into consideration. Okay, now in the early 1900s, they were getting and using railroads like Karen had talked about, and they were getting foods not only from California but also from Florida. Was that
it just made me think, like, when was the first time someone in West Virginia had seen a banana?
A banana, yeah.
Or even an orange.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Because these were produce that people in parts of America had never even seen. And we're approaching a time when they're going to not only start seeing them, they're going to start seeing them regularly during the winter. Because in Florida, that's orange season. That's citrus season in Florida's in the winter. You also
Yeah.
get strawberries and tomatoes,
Strawberries, yeah.
and those
Yeah.
are transported to the northern states.
Yeah.
Where
Strawberry
now,
festivals in February.
yeah, to where like now, and even back at the early 1900s, these states were starting to get produce that was fresh that they never had that time of year before fresh. They may have had them that were dried or canned, but they didn't have them any other way. So I'm not going to go into all the history about the Florida citrus industry, but I do have some websites I'll give to Karen so Karen can share them, that if anybody wants to read up on that, because the Florida citrus industry went through a lot of stops and starts. Initially, it was primarily in Jacksonville, and Jacksonville is far enough north that freezes can hit.
Yeah. That's not that far from Mississippi, is it?
Well, it's not. No, it's not that far from Georgia or anything. It's in the northern part of the
It's
state.
on the other end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a beach in Jacksonville,
It's
but
on
it's
the
not
East
too far
Coast.
from Georgia.
Yeah,
So
I'm thinking Tallahassee.
You're
maybe.
thinking Tallahassee.
Tallahassee, yeah.
So there was a time when they basically froze. They got smart. They're like, this is a long state. I'm gonna go further south. They're less likely to get freezes down.
This is a long state.
Yeah. So they did
Take
that,
you
and they
full 8 hours to get all the way down to the bottom.
So's Tennessee if you go east to west. That's a long state.
It is, yeah. Now, there were horse-drawn deliveries of fresh produce and meats where they had something called the butcher's wagon, and even milk were used into the 1920s to deliver foods to households. So that helped get things a little faster than walking it.
Mm-hmm.
The automobile, if I'm not mistaken, was invented in the late 1800s.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
but it wasn't used for transporting deliveries of food until later.
Right. In the 1900s is when we started getting that. But when they first started using it, the roads were in such poor shape that people were still using horse-drawn carriages because the horses in the carriages could get across the roads a lot better than the automobiles.
Yeah.
Right.
So
it's like a regular versus a four-wheel drive nowadays.
Right. And two, the first cars that came out, they're the distance between the tires, the axle, was set with the same as a carriage would be, because that's where the ruts in the road were.
Right. Okay, now there were automobiles that would eventually be used for delivery of produce and meats and stuff. But the autos did not fare well on the U.S. roads due to the poor road conditions. So Congress passed the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916.
Wow, all the way back to then.
1916, wow.
Yeah, $75 million worth. $75 million is what they pledged for the roads.
Back then?
Today's money, that's $2,233,587,378.64.
$2 billion?
Wow.
Yep.
Holy cow.
That's it.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of money, but that's how our roads started getting to be in much better condition. That does not include the interstates, because the interstates don't start until like mid-century. So I have not even looked at those yet.
Thank you.
So funding the states to improve their roads is what that was used for. And that did help improve the roads to where automobiles could then be used to deliver foods, which means your produce and your meats and your cheeses and your eggs started getting from point of origin to point of destination a lot faster, so they could get there before spoilage, so they could get further away for further delivery. And it helped get foods further out to families.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how exciting that must have been for people to see new food?
New food, yeah.
Yeah, right. I just can't imagine seeing and tasting an orange
for the first time.
Well, here's what I'm curious about, and I didn't bother to look it up to see if I could find the information, was what kind of foods did the first grocery store actually offer?
Well, I've got a little information on that, and I'm not to that right now, but a lot happened. A lot happened in the 1900s. We had, like I just mentioned, everything was pretty much the same until we started getting the automobile being used not only for transportation of people, but foods, mail, and who knows what else, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about that, and we can actually cut off there with automobile getting to be in use. And then we can come in next time and start talking about how refrigeration started to be putting in automobiles.
Yeah.
Okay. And we can also talk about specifically World War I and how World War I affected the American diet. And then if we have enough time, we can go in and talk about the Great Depression, what it did to the American diet, and then move our way on up through World War II and how it affected the American diet.
Yeah.
And then I'm kind of excited to get to talk about the Great Depression and stuff, because there's there's some very well-known food inventions that we still eat today that came about through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cookbooks too, because Depression era cookbook.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm kind of excited about that. So we can leave off there, but that's just a little insight about what we can bring in to talk about next time. And I know I'm the one who was given the 1900s, but there's plenty to share if anybody else wants to look up something.
Do you have all the information, like when the USDA started and all that?
I haven't got that far into it yet, because like I said,
Department of Agriculture, and
that's you can do that one.
It's so that there's a lot in this, because it's not only that, like Karen said, that there's the invention of the electric refrigerator, which was invented in, you said 1913, 1914. That did not become
1916 or something.
It didn't start becoming readily available until after World War I.
Right. Yeah.
Talk about electricity. When did electricity get in the homes, or most homes in the United States?
Right.
That had
think about the rural areas and electricity. I mean, it was a long time coming.
Yes. So it took a long time for that to actually happen. And these innovations they have greatly affected how we eat and what we eat.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Yeah. So the 1900s is going to be fun.
Yes.
And interesting, and probably make me mad when we get
the end of it.
Get towards the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll stop there and say goodbye and say thank you, Shalon, for arriving safely.
Sorry, it was in the middle of everything.
Oh, no. It's okay. We love you. All right. Talk in the chat and see you next week.
Okay. I'm going to get working on my story.
Yeah. I love you.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us in this latest episode of Sister Sharpens Sister. Join us next week when we go over everything that Delina just mentioned at the end of the episode. Talk to you then. Bye.